So this is our part 2 of transformational groups, reflective group leadership, powerful ways to help others find their way to their own truth and well-being. This is step 2, which is building harmony and balance in the group. So step 1 was setting the culture. So the Prophet ﷺ said, the best of people are those that bring most benefit to the rest of mankind. And I thought that was very relevant to what we are talking about, because we have the intention, I hope, to bring the best. And so this is to unpack, I guess, some of the things to be mindful of, reflective about, and to help our members of our groups be reflective as well in order to achieve that, inshallah. So when I guess it's really important that from the very moment you start a group session. So last time we were talking about, the lead up to the group. Now we're talking about, okay, now the group is going to begin. So I just want you to imagine for a minute, you're coming to a group for the first time and you're walking into the room and there's a few people there chatting in a group, and then there's somebody who looks like they're the one that's leading the group, but they've got their back to everybody. They're busy shuffling through their papers, setting things up, doing this, doing that, and kind of not really engaged with the group. What sort of feeling do you have when you walk into that room for the first time? It's not a very comfortable feeling, is it? It's kind of like, what do I do? Shall I just go sit down by myself? Do I go and introduce myself to the group? Do I go and interrupt the leader? So it's really important that from the minute any participant walks in the room, that they feel welcomed. So the feeling of the group begins from the first moment, or even before the first moment. So the feeling of the group begins even before any participants have arrived, in the feeling that we're having, which is why it's really important that we're organized and we're there in time to have laid everything out, that we're feeling comfortable with what we're going to do, so that we can be engaged and connecting with the people as they arrive. So setting that scene for the group and setting the scene for the session is really important. Making sure that it's not a mad rush at the end, and that the first session is breaking the ice with a new group, like remembering that, okay, we may know each individual in the group because we've had a connection with them leading up to that session, otherwise they wouldn't have been there, but potentially they haven't had engagement with each other or know each other. So we need to, break the ice. And then the opening part of the session for following sessions is to reconnect them, build connection. So we're going to unpack all of this today, inshallah. So the very first session with the group, it's about introductions. And you really do need to direct them and be specific on what you want them to share, to open up the group to knowing more about each other. So give them some questions to answer, make those questions relevant to the topic of the group. So for instance, if it was a parenting group, you might ask them to share how many kids they've got and what ages and gender their kids are, because that's relevant to the topic. You want to ask them questions where they can be slightly vulnerable, not too vulnerable, it's too early to get vulnerable, but slightly vulnerable, like a question like what they want to get out of the group is a slightly vulnerable question. It's also a very valuable question for them to reflect on why they're there, but also for you as a group leader to hear what their intentions are, what's bringing them to the group. So you don't want to get them to share too much, just enough that they start to get to know each other and you start to break down, the barriers between them. So as I said, with a parenting group, probably what I would ask them is to mention their name, the ages and genders of their children, and what's one of their biggest challenges in parenting that they'd like to have resolved by being part of the parenting group, something like that. So it's not too many questions. I think that's plenty. You don't want them to be struggling to remember the questions, but just enough to share and open the door for connection. Then in subsequent sessions, you want to start with something that reconnects the group. So we always do the gratitudes because that's a great way of opening things. But it doesn't always have to be gratitudes. As you know, when we did community and business development, it was like, what's a win in your business, or community development. It can be something that went well, or an insight they've had since the last session based on what they learned in the last sessions, changes that they've noticed during the week. Oops, there's a typo there. Of course, there has to be a typo somewhere. A response to a question you left them with from the last session. So in the last session, you might have asked them to reflect on something. So you could open up the next session with what did they come up with from reflecting on that question. So the opening and the closing of sessions is really important. It helps people get grounded, build the feeling from the beginning, build the connection between everyone. And closing it is also important too. So sometimes the closing of the previous session actually leads the way for the opening of the next session. So the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam emphasized the importance of intention in many of his teachings. And he said, actions are judged by intention. So each man will have what he intended. Thus, he whose migration, hijrah, was for Allah and his messenger, his migration is to Allah and his messenger. But he whose migration was for some worldly thing he might gain, or for a wife he might marry, his migration is for that for which he migrated. Now, there's certainly the spiritual element of that we want to make sure that we're coming into the group with our intention being to please Allah. But I wanted to take the intention and level deeper, that when you step into that group, you know your intention for what it is you want to share, communicate with the group, what you want to achieve with the group. Not meaning that we're goal orientated, it's more intention focused. Like, we don't want to come out of the group and go, oh, well, I didn't get there. It's about walking into the group with, okay, this is where I want to take the group today. And don't assume that they know what that is. Start the group with sharing with them, okay, today what we're going to talk about is, or what we're going to work on today is, like, so set the intention of the group early on after you've, connected everybody. So there's important considerations when running a group, from an Islamic perspective, but also from the perspective of the group running smoothly. One of the things that I was taught when I started working for the local city council in their community development department, they set us up to be leaders of various groups, but they said that it's not our job to decide what the group does. It's our job to facilitate what the group wants and needs. And so that required constantly consulting with them. And this is an important concept in Islam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and those who have responded to their Lord and established prayer, and whose affair is determined by consultation among themselves, and from what we have provided them, they spend. There are so many examples where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam consulted others on matters. His wives, for instance, one of his wives, when they were unable to go and do their Umrah, and because of the situation with the people of Mecca, and nobody wanted to, take, end it there. And so his wife said to him, let's just go out there and do it, and they'll follow, which he did, and they followed. And another example, I think, was the Battle of Uhud, from memory, when he asked the companions, their thoughts about the situation. So it's really important that you take a consultative approach to your group. Then your group feels that they are a part of it, that it's their group. It's not that they're attending your group, they are a part of the group. It really does build that sense of belonging, and belonging is really important. Justice and fairness is also a very important concept in Islam. You'll find justice throughout the Quran. Indeed, Allah commands you to render trust to whom they are due, and when you judge between people, to judge with justice. So that means we need to include treating our members of the group equitably and impartially. And that can be really challenging, because some people might get under our skin. Some people we may feel, more connected to. But it's very important as a leader, and the Prophet ﷺ, again, is the beautiful example of this. Everybody felt they were important to the Prophet ﷺ. He had that way in which he had everybody feel important. And the other part is our accountability and responsibility to those people. As we know, this hadith, each of you is a shepherd and each of you is responsible for his flock. So it's important for us to understand that we have a responsibility. If we create a group, if we bring people together, we have a responsibility to lead that group and to look after that group. And I'm going to go through these a little more here, and to how we might implement them. So depending on whether your group's online or in person, you can do different sorts of things. So online, you can do polls, questionnaires. In person, you might get them in groups with butcher's paper and pen and texters, and get them to brainstorm things together. There's lots of beautiful ways which you can get them to share and give feedback. One of the key things to remember, though, is you don't have to implement every suggestion, but they do need to be heard and responded to with wisdom. So every idea someone shares is an important idea, but some of them may not be practical, or some of them may be things you've tried before and they haven't worked, or there may be reasons why things that have been suggested can't be implemented. You still have to acknowledge and engage with the idea and make sure the person feels heard and acknowledged. And, you don't have to give them a huge answer as to why, but at least leave them feeling that you have considered that their words as important as anybody else's, even if it doesn't go ahead. Because one of the challenges is, if we try to implement everything everybody suggests, you'll find yourself running around after everybody, and actually your focus on the group will be lost. So there's that balance. We need to find that balance, and that comes from our own grounding and our own wisdom. Allah's always guiding us. What's the right thing to do, the best way to handle it? But there's ways in which we can take from them. Like, look, a lot of things that have changed it back to the fitra have been because of all of your engagement in telling me things or suggesting things, or just through our conversations of how this will be. We just had a conversation this morning where, Janine was talking about the accountability element from Landmark and how that was helpful. It's like, well, okay, let's bring some of that accountability into projects that we're doing here. Why not? So see how, that shura can be in an informal way, it can be in a formal way, but it needs to be there, because that's how people feel like they belong to the group. Fairness is also really important to belonging, because if somebody feels like they're not being included or not getting their share of attention, they won't feel like they belong. And there's a lot of things I learned from one of my mentors that was really important things to be aware of in groups. One is shared time. So one of the things you might have noticed is that if somebody hasn't been coached during the session, they'll be the first people I ask to share their takeaways. And sometimes if we've only got limited time, they'll be the only ones that share their takeaways, are the ones that haven't been heard during the group. So I like to start the group with everybody being heard through that connective activity, and end the group making sure everybody has had a piece of time and a piece of attention, even if it's just sharing their takeaway from the group, that they've been acknowledged before the group ends. And that's a very, very important point, that people don't leave a session feeling like they didn't exist in the session. Now that's online. In person, it's also important, because somebody can sit there very quietly, and the hardest thing is being aware of the quiet members. It's very easy, to serve the dominant members, and there will often be dominant members, but we also need to be able to set limits on the dominant members to allow the quiet members to have space. So holding space fairly for everybody in the group, and understanding group dynamics. So online, with all the cameras off, quite a lot of the dynamics may disappear. But in an in-person group, one of the things that I learned to be aware of is that if you have people in the group that are from a minority group, and then you have others that are, from the kind of dominant culture, for instance, to be very mindful that the people from the minority group aren't always going last or sort of sitting to the side, but also not putting them first so that we're putting them on the spot where they might feel uncomfortable, putting them comfortably somewhere in the middle. This was something I was taught by one of my mentors. The other thing is that if after a period of time you see that you've got certain members of the group are more outspoken, take up more time, is to make sure that you approach the other members of the group first, so that they get a share of the time. Because what can happen is the time gets eaten up, and then you've got this tiny bit of time at the end, and you're rushing the people who are the quieter people or the less dominant people in the group. So it is obviously takes time to get to know your group and who's who, but these are the things to be mindful of. So in the teacher that I was learning from, we had some Indigenous Australian people join the group. And so she was sharing with me not to ask this Indigenous woman to speak first, because that would be putting the spotlight on her, and that could be too much, but to make sure that she was like round about third or fourth. So there's a couple to warm up first, and then she's included in the middle. And then those that are usually the more dominant people would be kind of after her. And that way it's more inclusive. It creates a fairness around time and attention within the group. So responsibility, we have a responsibility to look after our emotional state and the emotional state of the group. So if we come into the group in a particular emotional state, we can actually kind of kick off an emotional state within the group. But also something with it that happens, as we know, can just kick off emotions. Feelings come from thought in the moment. Someone could start having some thinking and they get emotional. So watching the body language. Now that can be hard when it's online and people are just grey boxes, by the way, but you can hear in people's voices. even if you can't see their faces. Listen for unspoken messages and what's behind the words, and sense the feeling of the group, because that's going to tell you if the feeling of the group feels restless, uneasy, anxious or something, then something's going on. And we have the ability to handle that and manage that with wisdom, because Allah knows everybody in the group. Allah knows what everybody needs. Allah knows what's going on. All we have to do is be in that state of awareness of and allow Allah to guide us how to manage things, how to bring the feeling up in the group. You know, if it was a group that Harry was running, he'd probably tell the bear poop story and get everyone laughing. Not a bad idea. A bit of humor, a bit of fun, bit of engagement. And this is one of the reasons I love making sessions fun. And those who are going to be attending our training, facilitated training for Peaceful Parenting and Peaceful Hearts, will see how much I get people involved in doing things in groups. It has a metaphorical meaning, but it also it allows opportunity for people to reflect and process on the fly, rather than be sitting there dwelling in their thinking. Yeah, so you might end up having people have emotional breakdowns in the middle of sessions. I had a session very early on in the days when I was first doing Peaceful Parenting, where the sister felt so much pain, she stood up and she sprinted out of the room, leaving her children and everything behind. And I had to run after her. And in the end, you know, she was crouched down in the corner in the passageway, and I had to crouch down with her and spend some time giving her some space to release this massive outburst of emotion that had come over her. We were doing pillow fights, I think, and being playful, and it just kind of opened something up, and it was more than she could feel in the moment, and so she needed support feeling it. So that's another thing to be aware of. There was a situation in one of Mamoon's event in London that I went to in 2015, I think it was, a long time ago now. One of the women was being coached, and halfway through it got too much for her and she sprinted off the stage. So I, you know, went and sat with her and held space for her. So being able to also think, how am I going to manage my group if something like that happens? You know, do I have somebody in the room who is able to support someone like that for me, or do I have a plan, or how will I manage that? Another thing to be aware of is attendance. Be aware of when somebody just stops attending. It's real, the quiet ones and the non-attending ones, they're the hardest things for us to be responsible around, because it's hard to notice what's not there. It's much easier to notice what's in front of your eyes. So these are the things that are really important for us to be aware of when we're running a group. And then, of course, at the end, it's really important to tie it all together. Close up the session, wrap it up properly so everybody walks away with a good feeling, and walking away with, oh, I learned this. Or so I love doing takeaways because it helps me know what they took away, but it also helps them consolidate in their mind what they're taking away. Or maybe you leave them with some questions, or like you do a question at the end where everybody answers a specific question, or you get everybody to share a goal. When we were doing the convert support group, what we did was each week we showed up. We just it evolved into usually discussing about one of the problems that converts experience. And then we would start looking at what are the solutions. And then the final thing that we did was, like goals, was how are we each individually going to walk away being part of the solution to this problem rather than walking away with the problem? You can leave them with a reflection question for them to think about between that session and the next session. The idea being that, you know, you're leaving them in a state of wanting to, you know, go inwards, looking for more from what you've shared with them. And you could do a quiz and you could do it as a bit of a competition, like to see who's retained the most. I mean, I think that would be really great with kids. If you're doing a very soulful type of session with adults, probably a quiz is the wrong type of energy. A reflection question or takeaways might be more appropriate. So of course, you know, you want to make it appropriate to the particular group that you're running. But closing the group is really important. You want everyone to walk away feeling like the door opened as they walked in the door, and they're closing the door behind them as they leave. And there's just something important about that. And then there is, of course, the personal self-care and reflection. If it's been a tough group, we need to look after ourselves, and rather than go straight into managing the family or whatever else you have to do, take a moment for yourself. Take a moment to reflect and get yourself grounded again. And this personal self-care and reflection is just as important before the session as it is after the session. Give yourself space. One of the things I learned doing the chaplaincy course was that I wasn't allowing space between different activities for my brain to shift from one mode to another mode. You don't want to be going from a meeting, which is like a strategy meeting, straight into a group session that's meant to be very spiritual and reflective, and then you know, straight away go to looking after the kids, because they're three completely different energies. So give yourself the space for your, you know, personal self-care and reflection, inshallah. And I have a feeling that is it. So that is what I had put together for the next part of a reflective group leadership. So I'm going to stop sharing, come back here and answer any questions that you have. Anyone got any questions?
Just about impartiality and equability. Like the difficulty with kids. Like if you want one volunteer, you know, it's they're all so keen. Like, I wonder if there's a way that can happen.
So there's ways with kids, like for instance, what I did when I was doing one of my prac teachings is I had a little cup, and in it had popsicle sticks with each of their names in, and I would shake it, and then we would pull one out, and that would be the person. That's impartial then, because I haven't picked them. It's just how it came out. And then what you do is you take that, keep that stick out so that they don't get picked again, so that every it's somebody new. That's how you create that impartiality.
Perfect. Thank you.
And it's very easy, pop sticks, because they're quite, you know, because I was being a prac teacher, I was coming and going. It was something easy that I could pack away. Like I could have a different elastic band around the ones that have already been done versus the ones that are still to be done, sitting in my little tin. So it was easy to keep track of, you know.
It's like Nanny McPhee, or what's that other one? That super furniture kid, the suitcase with you.
Yeah, box of tricks.
Mary
Mary
Poppins.
Very-
But a bag of tricks. Yeah.
yeah. I've always got a bag of tricks wherever I go. Alhamdulillah. And anyone else got any questions? All good? All right, well, we might stop the recording there again so that we can keep that part separate.